In the lush valley of Zimbabwe lived a widow named Anenyasha. Her husband had died in a tragic accident, leaving her with their only child, a son named Idai. Idai was the light of her life, the one remaining piece of her beloved husband that she could hold on to. Anenyasha dedicated her life to raising him with love and care, ensuring he never lacked for anything. Though her heart was heavy with grief, Idai's smile gave her strength to face each new day. Time passed, and the pain of losing her husband became a dull ache. Anenyasha knew that she could never replace him, but she longed for companionship. Her days were long and lonely, and she missed the warmth of another by her side. One day, while fetching water from the river, Anenyasha met a man named Mudiwa. He was tall, with a confident smile, and a voice that was smooth and comforting. They began to talk, and soon those conversations turned into visits. Mudiwa was kind and attentive, and before long, Anenyasha found herself falling in love with him. Mudiwa filled the void in Anenyasha's heart that had been left by her husband's death. He was always around, helping with the chores, bringing laughter back into the home, and making Anenyasha feel cherished once more. Mudiwa, however, was less thrilled by Idai's presence. Though Mudiwa was polite to the boy, there was an edge to his tone that made Idai uneasy. He missed the time when it was just him and his mother, but he tried his best to be welcoming, knowing that his mother was happy. As the months passed, Mudiwa began to express his desire for a child of his own. Anenyasha, my love, I want to have a child with you, a symbol of our love, he would say, his voice tinged with longing. Anenyasha, though touched by his words, felt a knot of anxiety form in her chest. She had tried to conceive with Mudiwa, but it seemed that her body could no longer bear children. She feared that this would drive Mudiwa away, and the thought of losing him filled her with dread. As the reality of Anenyasha's inability to conceive became clear, Mudiwa's demeanor began to change. His warm smiles grew rare, replaced by cold glances and harsh words. He resented Idai, feeling that the boy received more attention from Anenyasha than he did. Mudiwa wanted Anenyasha's love to be solely for him, unshared and undivided. Mudiwa's jealousy began to fester, and soon he found himself growing hostile towards Idai. At first, it was subtle, a sharp word here, an unfriendly gesture there. But as time went on, his animosity became more blatant. He would accuse the boy of being lazy, of taking advantage of his mother's kindness, and of being a burden. Anenyasha, blinded by her love for Mudiwa and her fear of losing him, tried to dismiss his behavior as stress. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. Idai felt the brunt of Mudiwa's anger. The once peaceful home now felt like a battleground, and the boy began to withdraw into himself. He no longer played outside as he used to, and his laughter that once filled the home was gone. He missed his father more than ever, wishing for the days when life was simple and safe. Idai's heart ached with loneliness, but he didn't want to burden his mother, so he kept this pain to himself. Anenyasha noticed this change in her son, but felt powerless to help him. She was torn between her love for Mudiwa and her duty as a mother. She hoped that if she could only find a way to give Mudiwa the child he so desperately wanted, everything would return to normal. But as time went on, it became clear that this was not going to happen. Mudiwa's frustration grew, and with it, a dark idea began to take root in his mind. He was convinced that Idai was the obstacle standing between him and Ananyasha's full attention. The boy needed to be removed, but how? The thought of harming Idai filled Mudiwa with a strange mix of dread and excitement. He knew it was wrong, but his jealousy had clouded his judgment, making him believe that this was the only way to secure Ananyasha's undivided attention. One night, as Ananyasha lay asleep beside him, Mudiwa lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with possibilities, each more sinister than the last. Finally, a plan began to form, one that would rid Idai for good. He would not resort to violence, no. He would be more cunning than that. The boy trusted him after all. Mudiwa would use his trust to his advantage. The next morning, Mudiwa was unusually cheerful, a stark contrast to his behavior in recent weeks. He offered to make breakfast for Ananyasha and Idai, insisting that they both take it easy for the day. Ananyasha was relieved to see him in such high spirits and gladly accepted. Idai, however, was wary, but he dared not refuse. As Ananyasha stepped out to tend to the garden, Mudiwa prepared a pot of tea. He added an extra ingredient to one of the cups, a powder he had acquired from a traveling merchant. The merchant had assured him that it would be quick and painless, a perfect solution. Mudiwa stirred the powder into Idai's cup, his hands trembling slightly as he realized what he was about to do. But he forced himself to remain calm. This was the only way. When Ananyasha returned, Mudiwa handed her a cup with a warm smile. He then called Idai over, offering him the other cup. "Here, son, have some tea. It will warm you up," he said, his voice dripping with false kindness. Idai hesitated, but Mudiwa's gaze was unwavering. Slowly, the boy reached for the cup. As Idai lifted the cup to his lips, he caught a sudden chill in the air, as if a cold wind had blown through the room. He paused, looking around, but saw nothing unusual. Mudiwa urged him to drink, his voice tense with anticipation. Just as Idai was about to take a sip, something extraordinary happened. The room seemed to dim, and the air grew thick with a presence that was both familiar and foreign. Idai felt a strange pull, as if someone was watching him. He turned his head slightly, and there, in the corner of the room, stood a figure. It was a man, tall and strong, with eyes that burned like fire. Idai's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure. It was his father, but he looked different, ethereal, like a ghost from another world. The ghost fixed its eye on the cup in Idai's hand. Before the boy could react, the ghost figure moved swiftly across the room, reaching out and snatching the cup from Idai's grasp. Idai watched in awe as his father, the ghost, raised the cup to his own lips and drank the tea in one swift motion. Mudiwa froze, his face pale as he watched the impossible unfold before his eyes. Mudiwa's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the apparition before him. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A ghost drinking the very tea that he had intended for Idai? The room seemed to close in on him, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. His plan had gone terribly wrong, and now he was face to face with the consequences. The ghost lowered the empty cup and turned to face Mudiwa. His fiery eyes bore into Mudiwa's soul, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the ghost spoke, his voice echoing with the weight of the grave. "You dared to harm my son? he asked, his tone low and menacing. You think you can take what is mine? Mudiwa backed away, his legs trembling. He had never believed in spirits or the afterlife, but now he was confronted with undeniable proof. He had underestimated the bond between the father and son, a bond that death itself could not break. Mudiwa tried to speak, to explain, but his voice was caught in his throat. All he could do was stare in terror as the ghost advanced towards him. Outside, Ananyasha was attending to her garden, oblivious of the natural events unfolding inside her home. As she worked, a sudden unease gripped her heart. She felt as though something was wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The birds had stopped singing, and the air felt heavy, as if a storm was brewing. Ananyasha's hands shook as she placed the last of the vegetables into her basket. She felt the urgent need to check on her son. Rushing back into the house, Ananyasha found Mudiwa standing in the middle of the room. His face was as white as a sheet. Idai was sitting on the floor, staring at the empty cup in his hands, his eyes wide with shock. Ananyasha's heart raced as she took in the scene. What happened? She demanded, her voice laced with fear. Mudiwa struggled to find his voice. It was nothing, he stammered. Nothing at all, Mudiwa tried to convince her, his voice shaky and uncertain. But the terror in his eyes told a different story. Ananyasha, sensing something was terribly wrong, rushed to Idai's side. She gently took the cup from his hands and looked up into his frightened eyes. Idai, are you all right? She asked softly, her heart pounding with dread. Idai hesitated before nodding. I saw Baba, Mama. I saw Baba, he whispered, his voice barely audible. He was here, and he drank the tea. Ananyasha froze, her mind struggling to comprehend what Idai was saying. You saw Baba? She repeated, her voice trembling. Idai, what do you mean? Before Idai could explain further, Mudiwa interrupted, his voice rising in desperation. He's just imagining things. He's upset, that's all. You know how children can be. But Ananyasha was no longer listening to Mudiwa. She could see the truth in her son's eyes, a truth that Mudiwa's panicked denials could not erase. Something had happened in that room, something beyond the realm of the living, and it terrified her. That night, as the house settled into an uneasy silence, Ananyasha lay awake in her bed, her thoughts racing. Mudiwa had gone to bed early, claiming to be tired, but she knew he was avoiding her. She felt the distance growing between them, a chasm that now seemed impossible to bridge. She thought about what Idai had said, about seeing his father's ghost. The idea seemed impossible, but Ananyasha couldn't shake the feeling that her late husband was trying to tell her something. She had always believed in the spirits of the ancestors who watched over their descendants, but she had never imagined that her husband would return in such a way. Unable to sleep, Ananyasha rose from her bed and quietly made her way to Idai's room. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Idai was asleep, his small body curled up under the blanket. Ananyasha sat down beside him, gently touching his forehead. As she watched him sleep, Ananyasha felt a presence in the room. The air grew cold, and a shiver ran down her spine. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat, and there, in the corner of the room, stood the ghostly figure of her husband. He looked just as Idai had described, tall and strong, with eyes that burned like embers. His expression was stern, but there was a deep sadness in his gaze as he looked down at his son. My love, Ananyasha whispered, her voice shaking. Is it really you? The ghost nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Idai. I'm here to protect our son, he said, his voice echoing softly in the room. He's in danger, Ananyasha. You must keep him safe. Ananyasha's heart ached as she listened to his words. I don't understand, she said, tears welling in her eyes. What danger? Who would want to harm him? The ghost's gaze shifted, and for a moment his expression hardened. Mudiwa, he said, his voice filled with sorrow. He seeks to rid himself of Idai, believing that it will earn your undivided attention. But his jealousy has blinded him, Ananyasha. He cannot be trusted. Ananyasha felt her heart break at these chilling words. She had known Mudiwa was troubled, but she had never imagined that he could be capable of such evil. What should I do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The ghost stepped closer, his form shimmering in the moonlight. You must be strong, Ananyasha. Protect our son at all costs. The spirits of our ancestors will guide you, but you must listen to your heart. Mudiwa's true intentions will reveal themselves soon enough. When they do, you must be ready. With those words, the ghost began to fade, his form dissolving into the shadows. Remember, Ananyasha, he whispered as he disappeared. I will always be with you. When Ananyasha awoke the next morning, it felt as though the previous night had been a dream. But the lingering cold in the air and the heavy weight in her chest reminded her that it had been all too real. Idai was still asleep, despite the storm that was brewing around him. Ananyasha knew that she had to act, but she was unsure of what to do. Confronting Mudiwa could be dangerous, and she didn't want to provoke him any further. She needed to protect Idai without letting on that she knew the truth. Mudiwa was already awake when she emerged from Idai's room. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Where were you last night? He asked, his voice laced with tension. I was checking on Idai, Ananyasha replied calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. He seemed upset after yesterday. Mudiwa's expression softened slightly, but there was still a coldness in his gaze. He's fine. You worry too much, Ananyasha. Ananyasha forced a smile, though her heart was pounding. Perhaps you're right, she said, sitting down across from him. But you can't blame me for caring about him. He's all I have of my late husband. Mudiwa stiffened at the mention of the late husband. He is gone, Ananyasha, he said. It's time you let go of the past and focus on the future. Ananyasha nodded, not wanting to provoke him any further. You're right, she said softly. But that doesn't mean I can forget. Idai is still my son, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect him. Mudiwa's eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. Of course, he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. We both want what's best for him. But Ananyasha knew better. She could see the darkness in Mudiwa's eyes, the growing resentment that had taken root in his heart. She had to be careful, for both her sake and Idai's. As the days passed, Munashe's behavior grew more erratic. He moved between moments of forced affection and bouts of cold indifference. Ananyasha could feel the tension building, a silent storm that threatened to consume them all. Sensing the unease in the house, Idai withdrew even further. He spent most of his time in his room, avoiding Munashe as much as possible. Ananyasha did her best to comfort him, but she could see the fear in his eyes, a fear that mirrored her own. Ananyasha knew that she couldn't continue living like this, constantly on edge, waiting for the next outburst or sinister move from Munashe. She needed to find a way to protect Idai, but she was unsure of who to turn to. The villagers respected Munashe. They would never believe that he was capable of such evil. And if she tried to leave, Munashe might follow them, or even worse. One evening, as Ananyasha prepared dinner, Munashe approached her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, causing her to tense. "My love," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking. Perhaps we should send Idai away for a while. It would give us time to focus on our future together." Ananyasha's blood ran cold at his words. She knew this was Munashi's way of trying to remove Idai from the equation. "No," she replied firmly, pulling away from his grasp. "Idai stays here with me. He is my son, and I won't be separated from him." Munashi's eyes darkened, but he quickly masked his anger with another smile. "Of course, my love," he said, his voice dripping with forced sweetness. "I only want what's best for you, for us." Ananyasha forced herself to smile in return, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She knew Munashi wouldn't give up so easily, and she needed to be prepared for whatever he had planned next. Munashi's patience was wearing thin. He had tried to reason with Ananyasha, to persuade her to send Idai away, but she had remained stubborn. His jealousy and anger consumed him, and he knew he needed to act fast, or he would lose Ananyasha forever. One night, as Ananyasha and Idai slept, Munashi quietly crept out of bed. He made his way to the kitchen, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He would put an end to this once and for all. He reached into the cupboard and retrieved the small vial of powder he had hidden there. It was the same powder he had used before. This time, there would be no ghost to interfere. He would make sure of that. Munashi carefully measured the powder into a cup, filling it with water and stirring until it dissolved. He then made his way to Idai's room, his footsteps silent as he approached the sleeping boy. But as he reached the doorway, a cold breeze swept through the house, causing him to shiver. The air grew heavy, and Munashi could feel the presence of something. No, someone watching him. He hesitated, fear gripping his heart, but he forced himself to move forward. This was his last chance, his only chance to remove Idai from the picture. Munashi stepped into the room, the cup trembling in his hand as he approached Idai's bed. The boy lay peacefully, unaware of the danger lurking so close. Munashi leaned down, intending to wake Idai and offer him the poison drink. But as he extended his hand to touch the boy's shoulder, the temperature in the room dropped. The breath in Munashi's lungs froze, and his hand stopped in mid-air. Suddenly, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, swirling around him like a dark fog. Munashi's eyes widened in terror as the ghost materialized before him, more solid and menacing than ever. His eyes, those fiery embers of rage, bore into Munashi's soul, stripping away the thin veneer of humanity he had managed to cling to. "No," Munashi gasped, stumbling backward, the cup slipping from his grasp and shattering on the floor. "You're dead. You can't stop me." The ghost moved forward, his presence filling the room with an overpowering sense of dread. His voice was a rumbling echo, filled with the power of the ancestors. "You will not harm my son, Munashi. Your jealousy has poisoned your heart, but you will not take from me what is rightfully mine," it said. Munashi fell to his knees, his body trembling uncontrollably. He tried to speak, to beg for mercy, but the words died in his throat. The ghost loomed over him, and Munashi could feel the weight of his judgment. "You made your choice," the ghost said, his voice like the final toll of a bell. "Now you must face the consequences." Munashi scrambled to his feet, his mind racing with panic. He needed to escape, to get away from this vengeful spirit. He bolted from Idai's room, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fled. But no matter how fast he ran, the cold presence of the ghost was behind him, relentless in its pursuit. He burst into the kitchen, his hands fumbling into the darkness as he searched for something, anything to protect him. But there was nothing. He was alone, trapped by his own actions, and there was no one to save him. Munashe's thoughts spiraled into madness as the ghost continued to haunt him. He saw flashes of his life, his childhood, his dreams, his regrets, all interwoven with the faces of Anenyasha and Idai, the family he had sought to destroy. The realization of what he had become, an envious and bitter man, ate at him, tearing at the last shreds of his sanity. "Leave me alone," Munashe screamed into the darkness, his voice crackling with hysteria. "I didn't mean it. I only wanted her love." But the ghost was unyielding, its presence a constant reminder of Munashe's sins. As he staggered through the house, Munashe began to feel as though the walls were closing in on him, trapping him in a prison of his own making. The very air seemed to choke him, filling his lungs with the cold truth he had tried so hard to deny. Finally, he collapsed onto the floor, his body spent, his mind shattered. The ghost stood over him, its expression unreadable, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Munashe lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes wild with fear. He was a broken man, brought low by his own greed and jealousy. The ghost watched him in silence, its fiery gaze piercing through the darkness. "Have mercy," Munashe whimpered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please forgive me." But there was no mercy in the eyes of the dead. The ghost bent down, its form shimmering with an ethereal light. "You sought to destroy my son," its voice echoed. "You sought to take away what was never yours to claim. There is no forgiveness for such a sin." Munashe began to sob, his body shaking uncontrollably as the full weight of his actions crashed on him. He had lost everything, Anenyasha's love, his own humanity, and now, perhaps, even his soul. The realization that he had brought this upon himself was too much to bear. The ghost stood over Munashe, its form beginning to fade as the dawn approached. "Your punishment," the ghost said, its voice growing fainter, "will be to live with the knowledge of what you have done, to live with the emptiness you try to create in the lives of others." With those final words, the ghost vanished, leaving Munashe alone in the cold, silent house. The morning light began to creep through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. But for Munashe, there was no warmth, no relief. He was left with nothing but his guilt and the haunting memory of the family he had tried to destroy. As the first rays of the sun touched the horizon, Munashe crawled to the corner of the room, curling into a ball. The darkness inside him was all-consuming, and he knew that it would follow him for the rest of his days. Anenyasha and Idai woke that morning to find Munashe gone. The house was eerily quiet, as if the events of the previous night had never happened. But the shattered cup on the floor and the cold air that lingered in Idai's room were silent witnesses to the truth. Anenyasha knew in her heart that the ghost had protected their son, and for that she was eternally grateful. But she also knew that the man she had once loved had been lost to her forever, consumed by his own darkness. She held Idai close, vowing never to let anyone harm him again. And so, the widow and her son continued their lives, carrying with them the memory of a love that had transcended even death, and the haunting reminder of what jealousy and greed could do to a man's soul. The house, once filled with love and warmth, was now a place of shadows and echoes, a silent testament to the price of betrayal. But for Anenyasha and Idai, there was still hope. They had each other, and in that, they found the strength to move forward, knowing that the spirit of their beloved father and husband would always be with them, watching over them.